Come on in, everybody. We'll have the first presentation as part of the Heritage Weekend program. Are y'all having a good time so far this weekend? Okay, you're all asleep before I start. Are you having a good time this weekend?
Yeah, we're having a great time.
Good to hear, good to hear. Tweetsie is proud to put on these weekends, and we're certainly glad that you came. All right, it is 1:30. Just bear with me. The rides out there make a certain amount of noise. So if you have to move to hear me, you can. If that means you go to the parking lot, I'll understand. But I offered to Tweetsie to do a program today on the life story of number 12. You know, we were all surprised a year ago to find out, there was problems with the firebox and she couldn't run. I mean, they literally found that out 4 days before the event. And I have been a part of the process to get her fixed as far as historical research is concerned. They're making progress with it, but I won't take away from Tim's shop tour. I hear the first one went very well. But this is the story. I'm starting at the beginning. I'm actually starting a little before 12 was born. Our quote, before 12 was born. Because you got to find out about the family's history. For the few here that might not know, the East Tennessee and Western North Carolina Railroad and its sister railroad, the Linville River Railway, ran all the way from Johnson City here on the left, through the mountains, down to Pinola, and then up to Boone. That was 66 miles of up and down railroad. It went through 5 watersheds to get to Boone. So you were either going up or down.
How many runs did they make a day?
In the heyday of the railroad, when it was doing the best, you had a passenger train go out of Boone in the morning, and it would leave about 6:30 in the morning, get to Johnson City by 11. It had to get there by 11 because the Southern and the Clinchfield would come through right about 11. So if you were going to make a connection, you couldn't be late, or you'd wait till tomorrow, and nobody wanted to wait till tomorrow. Well, then they'd leave at 1 to come back and get back about 5:30, 6 o'clock in the evening. And if you drive the road that follows the railroad, if you drive it, you can't drive it in less than an hour and a half, and that's if you're pacing everything inside. So the railroad was slower, but not that much slower. Especially along the 105 part, you can't go anywhere on 105. Not in a hurry. But that's where, from built Cranberry, which is right in the middle, in 1882, the Linville River was built, the first part was built in 1899, went to Pinola, and started in 1915, they started the section going from Montezuma to Boone. First went to Shaw's Mill, because it was a big sawmill, and then on Boone, and they opened service January 1, 1919. So Boone had train service for a little over 20 years. They had operated for years on railroads designed for other people. Their big freight engine in the 1800s was based on a Colorado engine. Their 4, 5, and 6 was based on a Colorado engine. The 7 was unique, but it was a switcher. It couldn't go everywhere. The 8 was based on somebody else's engine. But they were doing so well in the 20th century that they went to Baldwin in 1911 and said, design us a steam engine. We've got this criteria, we've got this sharper curves, this steeper grades, the bridges can only handle this much. Design us a steam engine. And so they came back with this proposal for what became the number 9. And it was just designed to, and Baldwin was the biggest locomotive builder in the world at the time. And they could pretty much build something specific for your railroad to where it just fit perfectly. And the 9 fit that bill. That's her builder's photo. And you can see she looks like 12. But she was a little smaller. And they put this on they put her online, and she could haul freight faster and cheaper than the other engines could. So they were very happy with this engine. So, but they waited a little while. They had enough. The engines they had were not that old, so they kept running with what they had. So they came back in December 1916 and said, we want another one. Now, if you've been doing numbers, you got 9, 10, 11. Well, the next number was 12. They asked for a little bit. When you get into the specifications, they asked for a couple things a little different. She was about 2,000 pounds heavier, which helped her pull a little better. But this is actually out of the Baldwin book that's in the Pennsylvania State Archives now. And it says, they originally wanted it to be delivered between January and February, 3rd to 3rd. So the date of trial for 12 was February 9th. Well, even this piece of paper, I learned this a year ago, it was shipped February 19th. So it arrived and it was to be shipped to Johnson City on a flat car. So she gets to Johnson City, they get her unloaded. And the first story about her, learned from a guy named Tie-Dye Simmerly, who lived to be in his 90s. And he had worked on the railroad from 1916 on. And he remembered it like it was yesterday. And he would tell the same stories over and over and over, which helps you remember. But he was firing for this guy, and they told to stop at Shell Creek and meet this engine. That was the first sight he got of number 12 coming up the track, and it was in April. So it took them a little bit of time to get the engine in shape and put it on the work. Well, that was just right after that. They put a first-class passenger train on running to Shoals Mills, from Johnson City to Shoals Mills, turn around and come back. Well, that's what they put number 12 on. I can't prove it to 100% until 1920, but number 12 started out from day one pulling passengers, which sort of makes sense to what she's doing now. But 12 was one of the 2 trains. The 9 was the other. The 9 was perfect for a passenger train. Used less coal and ran the same speed. 12 is a new engine would work. You had to pull them off to inspect them once a month. And 12 would be out a day and then go right back. I've got the records that show day by day by day, month by month by month, year to year to year. 12 ran very consistently on that passenger train. And once they got the track on to Boone in 1919, she ran that afternoon train to Boone for a while. Let's do that. And this is the train she pulled. Train 2, well, on the timetable it was train 2 in one direction and train 3 coming back. She was the second passenger train to go out in the morning. Train 1 started at Boone, she started at Johnson City. They met in the middle and went back and forth. Everybody likes to stand in front of the steam engine. It keeps you from seeing parts of the steam engine. When you're a modeler and you want to see the parts, tell these guys to get out of the way, but we're 100 years late. But this is 12 in the early 20s. Big old headlight on it. And I've looked at these pictures enough, I can take pictures by looking at details like this. It's probably hard to see from a distance. This is a coal report from March 1925. Number 12 is on the top line. And she took coal chute on the 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 4th, and 5th. Well, she'd run to Pinola and back, and they were taking the engine to the shop to put her away for the afternoon, for the evening. Well, the guys running the train, Corey Ford was one, Chester Ford was the fireman, and the engineer was heading through the yard, and Tie-Dye had climbed on with him. He'd been to the eye doctor, and he was riding back to the shop with him. Well, I love to tell this. Chester's wife, Corey, was a beautiful woman, and all the railroaders knew it. And she was walking down the street, and all three of them turned and was waving at Corey Ford as they went by, and run headlong into a string of boxcars that the switcher was pushing toward the interchange. And they tore up 12 pretty bad. If you've seen any of the footage, where the 475 at Strasburg ran into a backhoe, you can YouTube it. They were waving at the crowd, and the switch had been thrown, and they went into a side track and caved in the front of the smoke box on a backhoe. And if the backhoe hadn't given 6 inches, they might have blown the thing up, because it just. And I figure the accident is pretty much the same. When we've had 12 apart down here, I saw some stuff earlier this spring. We've about to come to the conclusion that the frame took a lot of the damage. But that was 100 years ago this March. Well, they spend from the 5th to the 18th getting her fixed. Look, they didn't have all the fancy striping, didn't have all the fancy lettering. The lettering is there, it just faded. Because she was painted once since the time she come from the factory, and gold leaf paint fades.
She wasn't in New York.
Huh?
This says New York restaurant. She wasn't in New York.
That's the New York restaurant in Johnson City, Tennessee. Yeah, the depot is off to the left. Those buildings are actually still there. They don't have the letters painted on them anymore. But that's just switching around at the depot in Johnson City. The number plate's in here where you can look at it up close. But when she had that head-on collision, the number plate was all but broken too. And it is a half-inch or third of an inch thick piece of brass that was broken almost in two. And I used the word weld, they brazed it back together. When you work with brass, you don't weld it. But one of the shop guys spent a long time putting that number plate back together. And you can still see the crack in it 100 years later. This is from the early 30s. The ET&WC cut out a bunch of passenger trains by the time the Depression came along. They were doing one train a day back and forth. But they found there was enough tourism to run on Sunday, run a special excursion train on Sunday. It also helped that instead of it costing $3 or $4, they only charged $1. But you could just get on the train and ride to Boone and back. You had like 30 minutes or an hour in Boone and ride the train back. They'd done it in the summertime to where you were getting out of the flatland into the mountains where it's cooler. And so the excursion trains in the 30s brought a lot of needed money, especially to the crews, because this was every day except Sunday railroad. So if they got to work on Sunday, they got another day's pay, which went a long way toward paying bills. So the crews gladly ran excursion trains. This is from September 20, 1936. I point this picture out because the gentleman that took the picture was Robert W. Richardson, who the rail fans here will know is the founder of the Colorado Railroad Museum. He rode to Tweetsie in 1936, and then came up again in 1942. He came to Tweetsie. Curtis, you here? I was going to say he came here in 1992, but I think it was 93. And he came to Tweetsie and rode a train, and we went to Cranberry and looked around. And he was a very elderly man at the time. And he said, when I was here in 1936, I never thought I'd see that engine 60 years later still running. But he rode to Tweetsie. And what he did, he rode the excursion train to Boone. And he was a rail fan. And he rode it back to Newland, and the train had to stop and wait for the regular train to come through, because at that time they were running 7 days a week, the little mixed train. So he got off, the train was waiting here. Well, the dispatcher had stopped the regular train at Minneapolis to meet this train. So there were two trains waiting at two different places waiting for the other one to get there. He was not impressed with the dispatcher. But that's how we have the exact date. He rode the train back to Boone, stayed the night in the Daniel Boone Hotel, and said he saw the biggest bed bugs he'd ever seen in his life. And said he slept in a chair. Slept in a chair sitting in the corner, rather than climbing that bed. I was like, and of all the pictures that he took thousands of pictures, and this is one of the few that I know of has him in it. In 1938, they used 12. July 3rd was a Sunday. So they ran an excursion train up to Blevins and back. They backed up to Blevins, ran around the train on the passenger siding, and went back. Well, of course, Monday was the 4th of July, so of course they had to do another train on the 4th of July. But we get these beautiful pictures. There were a couple of well-known photographers taking pictures. And this is the sort of the famous ET&WC lettering. They had painted the engines green. Don't ask me exactly what shade of green. Go look at a Bachmann engine. There's a story there, but I won't get into it. But 12 was back to being the queen, if anything, for a day. But the guy who went took 24 pictures of the train that day, and I'm certainly not going to show you all of them. But this is the same, ma'am. This is sort of the same buildings that had the New York restaurant Now it's got a Coca-Cola sign. Well, it's not Atlanta either. This is in the Doe River Gorge. If you ever had the chance to go to the Christian camp at Doe River Gorge and ride the train, the track runs right up through the gorge just as it did 100 years ago. Well, the track's not as good a shape as it was 100 years ago. But you can ride through the gorge. This is a beautiful picture of 12 in the gorge with Sherman Pippin standing there. He was the most senior engineer, and he was a character. I'll tell you some stories afterwards about Sherman Pippin, or I'll tell you one or two here later. They're here turning at Linville Gap, and if you know where that if you go to the top of, you know where Linville Gap is on 105, now called Invershield, hop over the top and head toward Linville. This is in the woods off to the left, where that development's gone in. They're turning the train because they went to Linville Gap that day, and you could hike up on Grandfather and come back and ride the train back. They took the switcher out of service in August of '38 to do replacing fluids. You had to do that every 5 years. Well, they found pitting in the boiler, which meant that there were parts of the boiler shell that was thin. Well, the 7 didn't run again, never ran again, because that's a way to blow yourself up. Well, they needed an engine to be the switcher, so they said, well, we'll use 12. 12 couldn't pull nearly as much as 7 could. 7 was a bigger engine. So for the next 6 months, 12 pretty much strained their guts out, moving freight back and forth between Johnson City and Elizabeth. Because it was standard gauge cars. They had couplers where they could couple the standard gauge cars. And so that engine was pretty much working daylight to dark, keeping the plants going in Elizabeth. But that's why there's no cow catcher on there. It's for the people to ride, throw switches, and do couplings. You don't get to see the back end of the steam engine very often. This is 12 and 39. The cover over the steam dome is sitting on top of the cab. So they were doing something boiler-wise with 12 when this picture was taken. Sitting in the shop in 41. Like I said, they about wore out. I gotta keep up with my time. This is 100 years ago. Bob Richardson got back in November 1942, and they remembered him because he had sent them pictures. So they let him, they were running commuter trains for the rayon plants. And they let him ride on to Cranberry, and he got some pictures. 12 was pulling freight. They only had 3 narrow gauge engines left at that time, 9, 11, and 12. Well, the commuter trains to the plants were working 7 days a week, 8 hours a day, 3 shifts. So they had to run trains to take the first shift to work, bring the night shift, the late shift home. They made 3 trips to Elk Park and back because the flood had washed out the Linville River. They were running passenger trains 3 trips a day, taking kids to school and taking people to work. So it took 2 engines to keep that going. Well, they only had 3. So for all the freight they needed moving, 12 moved the freight. And from records I've got, she was working 6 days a week. And, just working hard. After the war's over, they put down new rails between Johnson City and the rayon plants. Well, they were 3 rails. You know, you had a standard rail, a 3-foot gauge rail, and a standard gauge rail. Well, they didn't want to relay all 3. They didn't want to spend the money for 12 miles of 3-rail track. So they moved all the equipment to Elizabethton, actually sort of the east side of Elizabethton, and put in a little yard and moved everything to it. So this is the first color picture I've got of 12 in 48. That was how she would have looked during World War II. Just a little cleaner. It's sort of funny that, unusual. Gentleman took this picture on October 20th, 1949. The very next day, 12 was parked in the engine house, little shed they had in Elizabeth, and didn't run again on the ET. Never ran again. They were doing work on the front end. Well, so this is the last picture of 12 in service on the ET&WNC. Well, the ET&WNC closes the narrow gauge part on October 16, 1950. They take the rails up in late 50 to May 51. And in late 51 and 52, they cut up for scrap 9 and 11. And everybody, if you stop and think about it, nobody knew why they didn't cut up number 12. Well, I know why. A gentleman had approached them, and this will be in the Shenandoah Central book. A gentleman approached them, wanting to buy an engine, passenger cars, and some rails. He wanted to do a museum to Narragansett. And I mean, he even wrote him a check for $500 and $1,950 to hold it. He goes to the banker to borrow the money. And long story short, the banker pretty much laughed him out of the bank. He was in rural Hall, North Carolina, and the story that was told to me, he's sitting there talking to the banker of what he wants to do, and a train on the Southern goes through on the way to Wilkesboro. And he said, why would anybody want to pay money to ride a train that doesn't go anywhere? And steam engines are everywhere. Well, the banker didn't know that within 6 months, Southern would drop fire on steam forever. And that diesels would replace steam within a handful of years all over the place, to where steam engines were suddenly rare, and narrow gauge engines were rare as hen's teeth. Well, he finally just had to admit defeat, and they gave him his check back. They didn't even deposit it. They didn't think that he could come up with the money. But the length of time he took trying to get the money saved that engine from being cut up like the rest of them. Well, they said, well, if one guy wants to buy it, maybe somebody else will want to buy it. So they just let her sit there. And in August, the letter is dated August 8th, 52. They got to Johnson City on the following Monday, probably on the 11th. A letter from 2 rail fans in Virginia saying, do you have a steam engine for sale? We want to do a narrow gauge museum. And they had written the East Broadtop, they had written several used equipment dealers, they had written the Rio Grande in Colorado, they had written everybody. The ET&WNC were the only people that replied to the letter and said, yeah, we got one. Well, it took them a while to respond to the letter, but it took these guys 2 days to come look at it. They were that excited to hopefully, see about buying it. But they didn't have a lot of money. So rather than deal with the local management who said, oh, we want $4,000 for this steam engine and $2,000 for the 2 cars, they went to the president of the railroad in Philadelphia. And he cut the price to a third of the asking price. Because he wanted to see it saved. I don't mean to be ugly about the other guys, but the local management said, we gotta get as much for this as we can get. But the president said, no, let's preserve this. So they struck a deal, and they loaded up number 12 on December 15th, 1952. She left the next day and never went back to Tennessee. But it was going to the Shenandoah Central Railroad that was in Penn-Laird, Virginia. This is actually the day after Christmas. I mean, y'all are either model railroaders or rail fans. Imagine buying a train for Christmas. That's what it grown to 3 guys. That's essentially what they did. They each put in $5,000 of 1952 dollars, which is $70-some thousand now. And they bought themselves a train. Well, they didn't even have a track to put it on. But they borrowed some rails from the railroad across the road. That was a friend of theirs, luckily. And they hauled 12 in and parked her on these rails. And they're actually working there. They got a rail right there in the picture. So that's how she rode up there. I had to take the smokestack and the whistle off because that's the tallest parts. And the Southern couldn't guarantee that they wouldn't hit a bridge. They spent the winter and the spring of '53 building a track, and they had a grand opening May 29, '53. I will tell one Sherman Pippin story on it. He went up there, and he wrote a letter about it that got published in the newspaper. And he loved to tell a good story, so I know he wrote this thinking it's going to be in the newspaper. Because he's sort of the hero in this story. He goes up there, and they had all these high-flute officials giving speeches. And they says, is anybody here from the ETNWNC? He says, yeah, I am. Well, come in here, sir. And they put him in front of the microphone, and he says, I can't talk on the radio. And they said, you go right ahead. And once he started, he wouldn't stop. He talked for several minutes about how safe the ETNWNC was. Nobody had ever died on the railroad. And it went through these mountains and did all this for the mountain folk. And finally one of them said, sir, your time is up. They had to hush him up because it was time to go on with the rest of the ceremony. But they opened the Shenandoah Central Museum/tourist line. They officially opened it the next day. And they operated, I love this picture because you can see things that you can't see because of the backlighting. You see all that detail under the tender and the wire going to the headlight. And I think Bachman used that picture to make their firemen to go with their G-scale 10-wheelers, because that's the exact pose of the fireman. But that's parked on the Shenandoah Central in the first season. They hauled like 9,000 people their first season. It ran a mile. It ran down to a picnic ground and then back. And it barely lost money the first year. I mean, a couple $100. They thought the next year would be better, so they had everything painted. So the good color picture of 12, and everybody looks at that, and you can look at it on my computer screen. You think it's a black picture, black engine. But the contract to have it painted said, we want you to use our special dark green. Well, the Pennsylvania Railroad had a formula for special dark green that is 7 parts black and 1 part green. So number 12 was painted, we figure 7 parts black and 1 part green. So when everybody says, oh, it's wrong at Tweetsie because it's green, Well, no, technically 12 was green on the Shenandoah Central. According to the owners. Well, the Shenandoah Central, to cut the story short that I talked about last year, Hurricane Hazel washed them out in October '54. Well, they went through a tail and a half trying to find a good home for it. Gene Aldridge was going to buy it, and then he backed out. Well, Grover Robbins ended up getting it, and they brought it to Hickory, because that was one of the closest places you could bring it when you're going to bring it to Florida Rock. Plus, Frank Coffey ran a shop there, and Frank Coffey was going to work on it. And the governor of North Carolina proclaimed May 20th, 1956 as Tweetsie Homecoming Day. And they had a huge crowd there, and oddly enough, Fred Kirby was there. Everybody thinks Fred Kirby started at Tweetsie years later. He was involved with Grover Robbins before there was a Tweetsie here to come to. But this is the crowd. This is most of the crowd in Hickory. They gave a lot of speeches. Everybody likes to give speeches. Well, a year later, they're bringing everything up 321 Mountain. Now, everybody that's a little older than me can remember how 321 up the mountain was a 2-lane road, and a crooked 2-lane road at that. And it was a steep grade decline. They got Moss Trucking out of Charlotte, which was a fairly new company at the time, to haul it. And it was a struggle getting up that mountain. They had to stop several times and let traffic go on. But Moss very quickly put up signs everywhere, and they had it on the engine with 12. Moss moves anything. And it was on a billboard in Charlotte for decades of a artist conception of a Moss truck hauling number 12 on a trailer. They really made a lot of hay out of that situation. Well, Tweetsie opens in July 1957. And of course they got it painted. This is not special dark green right here. This is light green. Frank Coffey would, he told me stories here for several years. We'd sit and talk. And he'd talk about going to Spencer, the southern shops at Spencer, to get stuff. Well, he'd take a bottle of liquor with him, you know, made by good entrepreneurs here in the mountains. And he'd take some apple brandy with him, and he'd walk in the main office guy's door, and he'd say, "Coffee, what do you want?" And he said, "Well, let's talk a little while first." And he'd bring a bottle and 2 glasses. Well, they'd have 2 or 3 glasses, and by the time they ran out or got low in the bottle, he'd say, "Just go get whatever you need." So he never paid a dime for any old steam engine stuff, because Southern didn't need it anymore. Well, he'd go and get Southern paint to paint this stuff. So the early years, I'm sure 12 was probably painted Southern green. Nice picture of, this is, and I've got the exact dates for some of these years here. But it's been going on here nearly 70 years. So I'm just hitting a picture here and a picture there. And I'm going to run out of time here before long. But you notice the difference. Let me back up one. That's how she had looked for decades, with a cap stack and a little bit of banding here and there. But you see, they had started this Wild West thing. And Grover Robbins was a genius. Grover Robbins could get people to invest money in about anything. But the one bad idea Grover had was he had a very successful Wild West theme park, but he wanted the engines to look like the Wild West too. So that's how we ended up with 12 looking like this. With a fake wood-burning smokestack and a fake oil-burning headlight that the crews always called it the bird cage. But 12 operated, and I mean, it didn't hurt a thing how she ran, but the rail fan community sort of turned their nose up at it and said, oh, that's just a theme park, Will. And they quit coming. The rail fan world sort of forgot Tweetsie for about 30, 40 years because of this doctoring up steam engines. And honestly, 190 was doctored up a little worse. You know, you're faking, you know, you got piston valves on something from the, you know, the 1870s. Nice close-up of it. The nice thing about it, the engine's here and it's running. 190 sort of gave them the opportunity to where she didn't have to run all the time. I mean, until 1960, every train they ran here was run with 12. And at that point, you know, 12 is 40 years old, which is old for a steam engine. Well, this is in the 70s. They had sort of gotten away from the Wild West look, got the stack back to normal. But you can see those brass bands around the stack, which is what the you know, what they did to backdate 190 today to the 80s, is the brass bands on the stack. They took her in the 1978 and did a thorough rebuild on her. And Frank Coffey was very proud of his engine because it was his engine. He usually had a phrase that went with it, but I can't say it in mixed company. Frank was a cusser. He really liked it. But he did it, it was an art form when Frank cussed. But this is the look that I knew as a kid growing up. This is from the 70s into the 80s. But that's how I remember it. And it was like that all through the 90s, 80s, until 1992. The engine was 75 years old. And I was volunteering here. I had started volunteering here in '89, and they didn't even tell me. This was such a secret. But they was having, you know, Old Timers Day is what they used to call it. And it was in June. And they would have all the old employees of ET and WNC come in. They'd come in, them and their family got in free, and they'd have a big ceremony every year to remember what these guys had done. That their hard work really made the Tweetsie Railroad possible. Well, they did this in '92. About all the old timers had died off, but they put a fresh paint job on 12. If everybody doesn't know, they have a paint shop that you can have a car painted in it. They're that good. It is a professional paint shop. That's why the engines look this good. So, but they lettered 12 ET and WNC. Frank didn't like it, but it wasn't Frank's decision. But this is a picture that Curtis Brookshire, who is here, took that day. And the engine was just gorgeous. And but it was the first time it had been lettered ET and WNC since 1950. Well, in '98, they took her in to do a restoration, do more work on her. And it is a rare thing to have everything off. So I was pretty involved in. That's how she looked. They had to take the wheels out from under her. I don't think they did that job. Maybe they did. But they let me climb in the bowl. And you look at me right now and you say, how in the heck did he get in that bowl? Well, I wasn't exactly skinny then either. It's a 16-inch diameter hole in the top of the steam dome. Well, what most people don't know, that your shoulders is what determines where you can go. Not your belly, because your belly will move up there. But I got in the bowl and took a couple of pictures. That's looking forward. That's looking back. Now, the conversations about replacing the firebox. You can see all these bolts that is holding that firebox in position. All those bolts are going to have to be taken out, and then they put a new interior in the firebox. But I included this so that you could see just what was involved. Heritage Weekend is actually 20 years old this year. Everybody forgot it. I mentioned it to Tim a few days ago, and he said, oh, you're right. So we'll make a big celebration on their 25th anniversary. But they did an ET&WNC theme for the Heritage Weekend in 2005. And they borrowed a car from a local, to have a nice shop here. 2009, 2013, and there's only so much you can do. You can't spend thousands of dollars repainting and relettering a locomotive for a weekend. But they run a special train, and we have a ball. So if you've only been last year and this year, come back next year when both engines are running and you will have a ball. I had to piece these two together to get 2017. The museum I'm connected to in Newton, we bought some cars out of Colorado. Well, Tweetsie needed a car to do some work around the track with. So 2019, we had the first mixed train ever at Tweetsie Railroad. They put a tractor on it, hauled it around all weekend with a coach behind it. This is in 23. And this is in 24. This is a week after we found out that 12 had a problem with the firebox. Well, I had pointed out that 2024 was the 70th anniversary of the second season of Shenandoah Central. And we got the children of the owners of the Shenandoah Central to come. We had a wonderful ceremony for them. They hadn't, neither one of them had seen 12 since she left in '56. So they got to stand in the cab as adults rather than being 5-year-olds. They were so happy to see 12 again. And 12, you'll notice that the steam is not coming out of the stack. So that's 190 in the background. But lettering her Shenandoah Central last year was my idea, and it would have been fabulous in the runtime. But it wasn't meant to be. But that brings us up to date. Y'all have had the shop tour. That's 108 years of a locomotive, but the story's not over. Just come back next year and we'll see her running again, we hope.
Will you join?